Hello my lovely Misfitians, and welcome to another video. On Instagram this week, several of you asked me to make a video about my favorite supplies, and that is how this idea originated, is actually from your genius ideas. And I am so thankful whenever you give ideas in the comments or even on Instagram. I really do read those and take those to heart, and usually I am creating a list of potential videos to do in the future. So that being said, please leave comments down below letting me know things that you would like for me to cover on this channel or even on blog posts on my website. I am always looking for new ideas. That being said, let's go ahead and jump into this video. Now, for this particular video, I do want to say art supplies are very much a personal preference of the artist. Just like artist styles and people in general, everyone has their own unique supplies that they absolutely love. And these three supplies, I have to say, really changed my painting dramatically. And I really wish that someone had shared this with me a lot earlier on. That being said, anything that I am discussing today, if you feel like you have a supply that you love more than these particular ones, that is absolutely fine. I am just going to be sharing with you what I absolutely love and what changed my painting style dramatically. And if you go back on this channel, you can actually see the difference when I made the switch to these three supplies about really 3 years ago. So I started YouTube about 4 to 5 years ago, and around 3 years ago I made the switch to these three supplies, and you can see a drastic difference in my painting style because of these. So what are these three magical supplies that I am talking about? Well, actually, all of them are in the same category, and that is watercolor palettes. Personally, I truly believe that there are three watercolor supplies that you really shouldn't skimp on. I feel like these three supplies are kind of the essential triangle kind of sides to a really great illustration. And those three supplies would be paint, paper, and then finally palettes. Now, I've already made a video on my favorite paint supplies and why I have chosen the colors that I have. I'll link that video down below if you're interested in that. And actually, I'm going to be making another video soon about paper, so stay tuned for that. But today I really want to dive into watercolor palettes and why a watercolor palette is so important if you really want to pursue this thing called watercolor. Now, before I get into why I use three particular watercolor palettes and why each one has a specific purpose in my painting process, first off, I want to talk about what is a good watercolor palette and what is a bad watercolor palette. So first off, let's talk about what is a good watercolor palette. The first thing when you are looking for a watercolor palette that you really want to look for is you want a watercolor palette that is pure white. And the reason for that is because first off, your paper is white. So as we're mixing our colors on our palette, we want to make sure that our colors are as true as possible as they would look on our paper. So when you're looking out in your art supplies or even in your porcelain or ceramic stores trying to look for smooth, flat surfaces, the first thing you want to look for is a nice, pure, white surface. The next thing that you want to look for is a smooth surface. You really don't want something that has bumps or grooves, and sometimes you can't even see these kind of bumps or grooves or these grainy textures. So the best way to actually figure that out is to run your finger along the surface of your palette. And by doing that, just touching the surface, you're going to get a really good vibe of whether this particular palette you're looking at is going to have a nice mixing surface or a bad mixing surface. And finally, the last thing that I look for is I like to have a lipped edge on the side of my palette, and that is to just make sure my water stays on the palette and doesn't run over the edge. It's pretty self-explanatory, but that is what I personally like. Now, what is a bad palette? I actually might ruffle some feathers by saying this, but one thing that I absolutely hate in watercolor palettes is plastic palettes. If you have been following me for any time, you know I do not like a plastic watercolor palette, and I use them for years. I use them pretty much for 10 to 15 years, plastic palettes, and I spent a lot of money on my plastic palettes, I have to say. One of my plastic palettes was $30, and in my opinion, it was one of the worst palettes I ever used. So why is it that I hate them so much? Well, the first reason is because when you are looking for a good watercolor palette, the very first thing that you want to look for is something that pools inside of that palette, or basically your water and paint create puddles inside of your palette. The reason why this is so important is because first off, this lets you know what your water to paint ratio is. Do you have a more watery mixture, an ink kind of texture mixture, or do you have something that's really chunky? That wide variety of mixtures you use in different portions of your painting, and there are specific purposes for each of these. So if you can't tell the difference in your palette between those three, that's really, really bad. And this gets us back into why I detest plastic palettes. For me personally, I had the hardest time getting my plastic palettes to pool or puddle inside of them. Instead, you kind of got this weird like beady look inside of your palettes, and it's impossible to figure out what your paint to water ratio is inside of your palette, as well as how much paint you've actually mixed inside of your palette when your paint is separating. This is one of the worst things you can actually have in a watercolor palette. Now you're probably thinking, okay, great, Carrie. Now I know what not to have, but at the same time, am I going to have to spend a huge amount of money in order to get a really good palette? Well, actually, I have some exciting news for you. No. Some porcelain watercolor palettes, when you are out there looking in the art realm, they will range you $100. You do not need to invest in them. I found other resources that are less. They're either $13 or less that actually work better, and these are my favorite watercolor palettes that I use on a daily basis. So my 3 watercolor palettes, they fit into 3 categories. The very first one is I wanted a palette that could store my paints well as travel with them. So the very first palette that I used that fit this category was a metal palette that I bought from Amazon, and I bought this for $13. The reason why I like metal over plastic is because, once again, I really want paint that pools inside of my palette. And if you take some just regular toothpaste and a toothbrush and you wash the inside of your palette as soon as you get it, you can actually scrub up the surface of your metal palette and allow those paints to pool inside of your palette. Whereas trying to get that with a plastic palette, I always had a really hard time with that. Now, I'm going to say this. This is not a permanent fix. As you use the metal palette, you're going to start to find that your paints are going to start to weird, like beady look again over time. And I think it's basically because you're removing that kind of roughed up surface. So I find myself every like 2 to 3 weeks once again kind of scrubbing the inside of my metal palette with a toothbrush and toothpaste. Now you want to be careful with this because you don't want to over scrub the inside of your palette because that can actually damage it, but you just want it roughed up enough so that your paint will pool inside of it. The next palette that I use is a flat, smooth surface palette. And a lot of times you will see in art stores, they'll have kind of these tin mixing trays. And while those are great, and I've actually used those, I find they're very expensive. And I personally would rather buy something cheaper that I feel like works better. So what I have done is I've actually gone to World Market, which is this kind of eclectic store of different decorating things for your house, as well as dishes and mugs and basically home decor stuff. And personally, I go into their ceramic and dishes section, and they have a section in that store that is just ceramic white dishes, which is perfect for a watercolor palette. And what I look for is a plate that is small. I like actually more the rectangular shape dishes. And basically what I do is I pick this up for $4. And this is what I use on a regular basis for just a flat, smooth surface. The reason why this works so well is, first off, it is ceramic. So since it has that nice smooth glaze on top, it allows the paint to pool so beautifully. And I never have to prep this surface. It's always beautiful as soon as I use it. Now, the bad thing about this palette is you cannot store your paints because it's open to the air elements. Your paints are going to crack. They're going to just get dust in them. It's not really good. So another secret that I actually use when painting an illustration is I use fresh paint pretty much every single time, especially for my larger surface areas. I'm almost always using fresh paint. If I only need a little bit of paint, I'll open up my metal palette because all my paints are stored in there. But most of the time, I'm actually using fresh paint when I'm painting. So for me, this particular setup for a porcelain palette is great, and it's super inexpensive. Another thing that's really nice is I'll actually have a couple of these on hand. And if I'm doing multiple paintings, I can just pull up different palettes that I've been working on throughout the day so that I'm not wasting my paint on that surface. So a lot of times I will work on 3 different paintings at one time that I know are going to have a similar color palette. And that way I'm not really wasting my paint, but I'm using it all fresh. So that might be another question that you're like, Carrie, if you're using fresh paint, are you wasting your paint? Well, no, because I'm usually planning ahead how I'm going to be using my paint palettes and trying to use as much of that paint as possible while it is fresh and while it is out. Okay, so those are 2 of the watercolor paint palettes that I use on a daily basis that have absolutely changed and improved how I paint. The third one is actually the first palette that I used that really taught me what is the difference between water to paint ratios inside of watercolor. But basically, it's a 6-inch flower well, deep well porcelain palette. And the reason why I love this palette is because this particular palette is like the training wheels to understanding your water to paint ratios. So when do I use this particular palette? If I know I have a large section of paint mixture that I have to use on one particular painting, and I need that consistency throughout the whole entire painting. So basically, let's say I needed to mix a background that I needed that color to stay exactly the same for the whole entire painting, and it needed to be a watery ink consistency, so it's very specific what type of mixture I needed. I will pull this particular palette out because the wells are so deep. I can mix a large amount of fresh paint in that particular water to paint ratio, and it will continue with me the entire painting, where I am not having to continually remix that color and then gauge, oh, is this color the same one that I mixed the first time? Oh, I don't know if it is, because a lot of times, here's a little tidbit for you, When you first mix your watercolor paint, a lot of times your color is darker than when it dries on your paper. So trying to get a gauge of what your color looked like when you first mixed it is really difficult. Unless you really understand that color really well, it's very, very hard to remix the same color that you started out with if you run out mid-illustration. So to prevent that from happening, I will use this particular well, especially if I know I need to use it for a large portion of my painting. So those are the 3 supplies that instantly improved my paintings, and I am so thankful that I found these 3 years ago. They have completely changed how I approach a painting, and I really hope that these help you as well. They're not really expensive. They are so crucial if you really want to succeed and you don't want to be frustrated in this particular art medium, which is very difficult at times, but it is so much fun and so rewarding at the same time, especially when you have the right supplies. Now, I just want to say, if you are interested in understanding more about water to paint ratios, I talked about a lot of that in this video. I have a course on that, and I will link that also down below. Right now there is a sale going on, so you can actually pick that up for half off. So make sure to check out that link down below. But I go into depth about that particular skill in watercolor, and also I give you a free drawing template that you can play around with as well. So once again, I hope you are having a fantastic week, and I will see you next time. That's it for this video. Lots of love, y'all, and keep painting.